Here's hoping this video is not a total disaster. Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today I wanted to discuss a topic, I guess, that I've had on my mind for, at this point, basically a couple of years. This video idea and the one that, spoiler alert, will be coming next week is kind of a two-part discussion that I wanted to have about the importance of both literary fiction and classics a little bit more broadly, I guess, as well as the importance of general genre fiction and the types of tropes and stuff that are kind of inherent to those, and why both of these things are important, and why you should not just slough off one and only focus on the other, or vice versa, you know, whatever may be the case. You see, I have a group of friends on Discord, and there was a point in time where we were all part of one specific server in particular, and some of us decided at one point that we were going to read some books that were a little bit out of the norm of that server. That server was a little bit more focused on fantasy, particularly epic fantasy, a little bit of sci-fi and horror and some stuff like that on occasion. But we wanted to start reading a classic every month. Now, whatever determines a classic is pretty broad, and we'll kind of talk a little about some of these things. But generally speaking, we wanted to read a classic a month for a little bit of extra variety in our monthly reading plans. Eventually, however, this group got the reputation amidst the server, amidst a particular group of the server, of, you know, being fart sniffers or something of the like. In fairness, the main reason for this, or at least no insignificant portion of this, was because of a particular one or two people who were kind of being a little bit of elitists about their classics or their literary fiction or their magical realism reading, as opposed to epic fantasy and sci-fi. But as a result, the rest of us who were kind of associated with that group, even if we weren't being this way, simply through association, wound up with kind of the same stigma, and it really started to irritate me and some of my other friends as a result. Ever since then, I've kind of wanted to discuss this topic in a little bit fuller detail. I believe that classic novels, and literary fiction in particular, are necessary to a balanced reading landscape. I don't just believe that many are good books, I believe that you should read some more of them if you aren't super inclined to read a lot of them, and I also believe that people who read a lot of classics and literary fiction shouldn't only read that. I believe there's a balance to be struck here, but again, some of these things we'll talk about a little bit later, or even in next week's video. In this video, I aim to explore some of my thoughts on why classics matter, and why literary fiction, even if some of those books aren't classics, even if they're not old enough to be classics, or whatever your personal determination for what those lines are, and they are pretty vague in some cases, those books aren't just for fart sniffers. P.S. Yes, I obviously know that classic and literary fiction, as I've kind of used them in this introduction, are not one and the same. They're not identical. The distinctions that I make between these will kind of come up as relevant throughout the rest of the video, but otherwise, they're more or less used interchangeably, because for the focus of today's video, they're basically the same thing for all intents and purposes. So we'll start from there. You'll have noticed that I've been kind of motioning to this sort of area of my desk over here, and you can kind of see the corners of some of the books poking out here. I've got an absurd amount of books stacked over here, and I've got a lot of words and notes to go through, so I just hope that, like I said at the beginning, that this video isn't a disaster. Let's begin with a little bit of where I started with reading some classics. Now, like many others, probably our biggest, I guess, introduction to certain classics out in the world is with school and assigned reading in school. Some of the books that I recall reading off the top of my head, being required to read, that I would consider classics or anything like this back in school, were like To Kill a Mockingbird back in freshman year by Harper Lee. I remember having to cover that. I remember covering Fahrenheit 451 in sophomore year or junior year? Somewhere in that range. Whatever year I covered Fahrenheit 451, Animal Farm, we also did. We kind of covered a couple of Shakespeare's plays, particularly Julius Caesar and Hamlet. We covered those alongside some of their or adaptations. We even read Oedipus Rex. I just now recalling off the top of my head, we covered a little bit of that. There were some, random like short stories and stuff in high school, and also a little bit of junior high school, where like certain Edgar Allan Poe short stories were read, like Mask of the Red Death, I believe happened in like sophomore year. And we covered The Telltale Heart, I think, in like 8th grade. I might have some of the years wrong on some of these things. Telltale Heart might have even been freshman year, but the point remains the same. We covered a little bit of Poe and kind of similar stuff like that. I can remember reading a little bit of Jack London, and the irony of me holding up this copy is it says the complete 57 short stories. Jack London wrote a lot more than 57 short stories, and the one story that we covered in high school, and probably his most famous short story, is To Build a Fire. That's not even in this collection. But tangents aside, I do recall reading a lot of stuff like this. I even recall, I'm pretty sure we read The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, but I don't think it was a full version, even though Old Man and the Sea is not long. I think it's like less than 100 pages. I'm pretty sure we read like 50 pages of it or something like that. But either way, the point is, a lot of my early experience with classics was through schooling and stuff like that, and I'm sure many other people had a kind of similar experience. There's, pros and cons to this. There are many people who don't really like reading as a result of school. There are people who have never touched a book since high school, and many of those people have never touched a book since high school because they hated assigned reading so much. There are other people who found they loved the books that they were made to read in high school, and went on to read a lot more themselves. I'm kind of in both boats. Many of the books that I read in high school I actually really enjoyed, but otherwise didn't really spend much time reading in like high school in particular outside of that, because I just had other interests or didn't have time, or in the case of a couple of years of high school, I was just too depressed to read, but that's a story not for this channel. I actually largely enjoyed reading all of these examples that I gave that we read in English class, but most of what I read, like in middle school, junior high school, the couple of books that I read during high school weren't actually classics or literary fiction. I believe, like most other people, it was very often more like contemporary fiction and, being in school, specifically YA fiction. Sorry, I had to get those out of the way so that I could actually, talk a little bit more here. Percy Jackson and the Olympians and Rick Riordan's work in general was much of what I read in middle school and junior high school. A lot of what I loved was a lot of Rick Riordan's work, so that's contemporary YA. An assigned reading book from 8th grade, actually, I am number 4. The Lorien Legacies became a favorite series of mine because we were assigned this book, and basically the entire class the entire grade really had to fight over the books at the library. The school had, I believe, 2 copies of each book in the series, or maybe just one. The public library had 2 copies of each book, I think, and they were just always missing because somebody in the grade was reading any one of them at any given point in time. That's how influential this was, even though it is, again, more contemporary YA. One of my favorite, like, YA middle grade-ish type of series, The Underland Chronicles, is something that I really enjoyed at the time. I also love Phoenix Island by John Dixon and its sequel, Devil's Pocket. We'll actually bring this up a little bit later. The Card Turner by Louis Satcher was a favorite. Of course, Holds is also a classic. That one I read back in middle school. And then one of my favorite series from elementary school was The 39 Clues. Some other YA stuff that I read part of the series but didn't finish because of more problems with reading too much of a series at one time rather than not enjoying them. Ranger's Apprentice, I liked the books that I read. The couple Fablehaven books I read, I just absolutely snarfled down. I read a couple Levin Thumps books as well. So this kind of like contemporary 2000s YA type of stuff is a lot of what I spent my time reading when I was younger, and a lot of what I loved the most. I enjoyed a lot of those classics that I read, but this is what I read more in my free time. But again, even here, we can kind of see that there was a balance of my reading just kind of inherent of what was assigned in school versus what I enjoyed reading myself, and, coming to enjoy both of them. Then I had several years where I had what I consider to be a reading hiatus, my multi-year reading slump, if you will, after which I came back with reading some certain political stuff, but especially like epic fantasy was how I got back into things. I decided that Tolkien, being more or less my gateway back into reading. Would be a good way to get into stuff. Stephen King was also a pretty common occurrence in those first few months of me coming back to reading back in late 2021. Various of these books I covered early in 2022 when I started my BookTube channel, or started doing BookTube on this channel because I had some stuff from before that. But yet, I also wanted to read some other stuff at the same time. I came back to reading with this type of material primarily, but there was other stuff I also wanted to read. And that's where the monthly classics comes into effect, because Frankenstein in February 2022 became the first monthly classic I joined for. In fact, I'm pretty sure the monthly classics thread that was started in the Discord server that I kind of briefly hinted at earlier was started with Frankenstein. I'm pretty sure this was not just my first monthly classic. I'm pretty sure it was the first monthly classic in that Discord. I then came to read nearly every classic for the next year and a half, or, you know, the ones that I didn't have time to read or something else happened. What I missed, I have made points to catch up on, where I either caught up on them later or I am catching up on them now. For example, a book in, I believe, like summer of 2023 or something like that, Don Quixote was the monthly classic, and I'm just starting that basically now at the time of this video's release. The time of this video's recording, the day before that, I just read the introduction and note on the translation and stuff like that. So, you know, I made a point of wanting to read classics and wanting to catch up on some of the stuff that I missed because I enjoyed the variety it provided. And basically, that's kind of the topic we'll get into now. Frankenstein was a slam dunk because it was something different, and also different from what I expected, and it was fresh from some of the other stuff I was reading at the time, and was a good influence to allow me to let classics permeate my general TBR. But as kind of a general discussion, I want to move on to the topic of the variety inherent to a genre that is as vague as classics, or rather literary fiction, perhaps a little bit better of a genre. I let classics stay a part of my regular rotation on my TBR for such a long time because of the variety it allowed for. All the while, I would be reading, you know, participating in certain like read-alongs aside other stuff, like The Dark Tower by Stephen King was a series that I read for read-alongs. Sun Eater by Christopher Ruocchio pretty shortly thereafter I did as a read-along. Even Lord of the Rings I did as a monthly read-along, where each book was read month after month after month. And in order to fill in a little bit more of those gaps, if you could read, you know, more than just one book in a month or just a couple books, I wanted there to be a classic to kind of solidify everything else. A little bit of a through line with a consistent, like, we're going to have something here, but it was something that we got to vote on reading, what we wanted to read the most, and again, was something a little bit different, inherent variety to reading a genreless genre, if you will. Because you see, classics is not really a genre at all. There's no real true checklist of tropes or anything that you could say defines classics outside of being old or being able to stand the test of time. Furthermore, they span the widest degree of time. Anything can be considered a classic, from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is like, I believe, the oldest like fictional story that we know of. I might be wrong on that particular detail, but the point remains the same, all the way up until, you know, whatever decade you want to personally arbitrarily assign as being the cutoff date for classics. For example, somebody I know considers 1965 around the time where before that, your book is probably a classic, and after that might be a little bit more debatable because of, again, kind of arbitrary reasons, but still, the point remains. The only thing that really defines a classic is that it is old and that we still know about it and that people still read it a lot, to the point that that is essentially the definition of what a classic is, standing the test of time. Whether it stands the test of time for resonating with multiple generations of audiences because it contains some deeper truth to humanity or the world or society, or has some other type of commentary that means something to the readers, whether it be for simply surviving in the midst of other competition, or if you have, you know, so many other books that are out there, what rises to the top, and those things are going to just inherently last a little bit longer in the cultural zeitgeist, we shall say. It could even be for simply being all we know from ancient civilizations. Like I said, the Epic of Gilgamesh is a good example. Things like Greek poems or plays, Greek theater, a lot of these things that we know of, they're actually relatively few. Like, we don't actually have that many Greek plays. We don't have that many Greek literature because not a whole ton of it actually survived. So what we consider to be classic Greek literature is basically just all of the stuff that we still know of. You know, it stood the test of time simply because we discovered it and we have it actively. So, you know, there are multiple aspects of how something can stand the test of time, but that is basically the definition of a classic. More importantly, however, classics are very often defined by their literary excellence, the actual quality of their writing and what is contained therein to make an impact. You know, if it resonates, if a book resonates with multiple generations of audiences, it is probably because of some literary excellence, whether that's in the storytelling or in the plot, even though a lot of classics don't quite have plot the way that we think of them today, or the way that we think of plot today, generally speaking. A lot of classics have a more, I don't want to say advanced prose, but the writing is something that you generally have to pay at least a little bit more attention to fully digest, because, well, some of it's just archaic language and other of it is just absurdly beautiful. It just kind of depends on the author and the time frame, because like I said, classics isn't really a genre. There's not anything that really binds together what a classic is. But a lot of classics are literary fiction. The literary excellence type of thing kind of goes along with this idea. But what makes literary fiction a genre? Is it even a genre? I would argue it's not really a genre, because most genres in genre fiction, like science fiction or fantasy or horror or really any of these types of genres as we think of them today, whether or not that description is actually accurate, the way that we think of genre today is as particular subsets of tropes, where not every book within that genre is going to contain every trope, and heck, some of them might not even contain any of those tropes, and those are usually the ones pushing the boundaries a little bit. But very often genre fiction is defined by the general tropes and the vibes that are associated with them. Science fiction very often has to do with technological advancement. Particular subsets of it have to do with spacefaring. You know, there's space operas are a particular subset of science fiction. And then fantasy has various different types. You have urban fantasy, which is more like, you know, cities, set in cities that are more or less akin to kind of how we understand them. There are the ones that are a little bit more grounded in reality. There are some that are more portal fantasy, where you are literally in the real world and get transported to another world through a portal. You have epic fantasy, which is generally like entirely new creations of worlds, things that are effectively entirely separate from our world and that are populated by creations of the author's imagination. All of these types of books in various different genres have subsets of tropes and groupings of tropes that are very often utilized that define the genre. Literary fiction doesn't really have any of those things. Very often, it is just the fact that they are more literary in effect than focused on genre. It might be the fact that they're bucking all of the trends of a genre, and it might even just be the fact that they are inherently genreless, that they don't fit into any given genre because of what they're doing. And so we just call them literary fiction because they're different, or because they're trying to be something different. I think many of the reasons why a lot of classics are literary fiction is because most of the genre fiction that we know today, most of those genres themselves, haven't actually existed quite for long enough for very many of their books to be classics in a broader sense. You know, you can have classic sci-fi, which is, you know, just older science fiction, or classic fantasy, which is like Tolkien or other early fantasy, but these things aren't often really thought of the same way as classics are. But there's other stuff that is. Let's say like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne are, in my opinion, the way that I think of them personally, these are classic authors. But they're also science fiction authors. H.G. Wells in particular, well, actually both these two were kind of pushing the bounds for what science fiction meant. at their time of writing, but they were so early writing this type of material that it wasn't really a proper genre. Science fiction wasn't really a thing when these guys were writing. And so I feel like part of that is kind of transported itself to today, where I think of these authors more as classic authors than I do as science fiction authors, even though they are very much science fiction authors. You know, it's kind of one of those weird type of dichotomies. Genre fiction can become classics, but not all classics really fit into various different genre fiction tropes. At the end of the day, a lot of it is arbitrary, but I think it's just because the idea of tropes and, you know, stories sharing certain storytelling ideas or different elements that make them familiar to one another wasn't fully a thing as writing in general was becoming more of a popular pastime, and why as reading was becoming more of a common pastime. You know, when the printing press and stuff like that became a thing and novels could truly be sold as their own form of entertainment, a lot of early writers weren't trying to be like other writers. They were just writing stories. As a result, you have a lot of unique ways of telling stories, to the degree that many aren't even telling a story and are rather more exploring philosophical or psychological or theological ideas, more so than they are a strict plot. As time goes on, and especially in more recent decades, literary fiction is inherently more experimental because they are trying to buck all of the trends of modern writing ideas and using those ideas to create something a little bit more out of the ordinary, exploring inherent non-tropes. So some ideas of this, I gotta get into my stack to grab a couple of the books. Oh, wherever they are. Infinite Jest, for example, is a great example of something like this, where you have certain subsections of the book that explore certain genre fiction ideas, but for the most part, the book itself doesn't really fit in any given genre. David Foster Wallace is inherently trying to buck all of those trends and do something a little bit different, a little bit more experimental. Another good example, and a book much shorter, is David Diop's At Night All Blood is Black, which I don't actually have in the stack over here. I just thought of it off the top of my head. Very different from anything else I've read, and probably different from just about anything else I'll ever read, because it was written quite recently, I believe in the last 7 years or something, and is not doing any genre thing at all. It is exploring the mind of a man at its most simplest form. That is part of what it's doing, and as a result of what it is exploring, and because it's not using any other tropes to do that, it doesn't really fit in any proper genre. So TLDR, classics is not really a genre. Literary fiction is barely a genre, and is mostly defined by the fact that it is not a genre, the way that we think of it anymore. So both of these things just kind of end up being tied hand in hand when it comes to general discussion, to the point that just as many literary fiction books of several decades past and older are just considered to be classics on account of them being old. We'll say Don Quixote as a perfect example over here. That's arguably the first novel. It is a book that really defined what novels would become, and without it, we might not have novels that exist in the way that we have them today. Maybe we still would, but Don Quixote's influence on that was pretty huge. In that way, it is more or less the definition of the classic novel, and I think that much other literary fiction today, more modern literary fiction of the last few decades anyway, a lot of these books are things that we tend to kind of give the terms of modern classics. I think a lot of modern classics are literary fiction books. A lot of the books that we think of as oh wow, yeah, this will stand the test of time, this is a classic, is because they're books that remind us of older classics, but they're too new to be considered classics in that way, hence the modern classic title. So to kind of get back to the point of what I was saying, and after, talking for way too long about this topic, basically what I'm getting at is a genre that is scarcely even a genre at all is kind of inherently going to provide a lot of variety. If you have a collection of books where they could have been written at any given point in time, really by any given person, just pick one out and they could write a book like that. And the fact that it's not going to have super familiar tropes and ideas that connect it to particular genres, a lot of classics are just going to be different from one another. They're going to be very unique. Some of them might call back to others, but the variety is kind of the point that I'm getting at. I allowed myself to keep classics as a part of my regular reading rotation because of the variety, and I think this is a large part of why people should read more literary fiction. If you're bored with modern science fiction and fantasy, if you're bored with horror, if you're bored with any of the other genres that you spend too much time reading, you can always branch out to something a little bit different, and classics is a great way to just have a very large variety of books that do very different things. From The Picture of Dorian Gray to The Count of Monte Cristo to Les Miserables and Don Quixote and Charles Dickens in general and any other classic author that you can think of, Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, all of these authors are doing very different things, and there's a lot of variety inherent to those kinds of books. We lump them all into that same classics package, or literary fiction more broadly, but the variety is super nice. So let's talk about one of the things that I find to be the most rewarding about reading a lot of classics and literary fiction. That is the ability to be able to analyze a lot of it in a more deeper manner than much of modern genre fiction allows for. This is not to disparage genre fiction in any way, shape, or form, but it is simply the case that a lot of modern writing, a lot of the last few decades of fantasy or sci-fi or whatever have you, is a collection of tropes just kind of telling a story using those tropes to do it. That's not to say that those stories can't be deep. Many of them are. Many of them are my favorite things. But there's also the stark reality that much of modern writing doesn't really feature a whole ton of the depth that much literary fiction does. You see, a lot of what literary fiction does, as we understand it, is explore inherently the meaning of reality and of life and humanity and our purpose in the world, and seeks to depict a lot of these things in relatively figurative ways. It uses a story, or it uses characters, it uses certain plots to explore those ideas, but much of literary fiction is about the depth. It is about exploring particular topics. It is about the authors digging into themselves to understand themselves a little bit better, or to understand the world a little bit better, or something along these lines. Once again, that doesn't necessarily mean that modern genre fiction doesn't do these things, because, again, some of it does. But not all of it does. Much of modern entertainment is simply entertainment for entertainment's sake. That's not inherently a bad thing, but if almost everything you read is this kind of stuff that you could pick up and read in just a couple days and put down and forget you ever touched it, it is, for me, comforting to know that I can read something a little bit older that explores a little bit of different ideas in different ways, and does so specifically for the point of being able to explore those ideas, specifically to analyze those ideas, specifically to have a discussion about them. I'm sorry for this portion of the video probably being pretty cut up, because I'm having to just splice together certain thoughts. It's kind of hard to express these ideas, because I'm trying not to express any form of snobbish type of idealism in regards to literary fiction or classics. I'm not at all trying to tell you you should stop reading genre fiction and you should only read literary fiction, because again, like I said at the beginning of the video, I think there's a balance. What I want to do is encourage certain people to read more literary fiction, and even vice versa, as next week's video will attest to. Because I know and I recognize that literary fiction and classics readers, people who only read these types of books, can very often come across as snobs, as people who don't just read that pig slop popcorn shit. It's also reading deeper books, more meaningful books. And again, not trying to say that genre fiction can't be deeper, or that it can't be meaningful, or that it inherently isn't, because I know and I recognize that that's not true, and that people who say that kind of stuff are really annoying. You know, they are very much snobbish when they say things like that. It's just kind of hard to really say that there's a lot of really great stuff. There's a lot of depth and a lot of worth in reading certain classics and literary fiction if you don't read very much of it. I think it is worth trying. I think that one particular way that genre fiction proves that it is not inherently unworthy or that it cannot contain certain deeper things is the fact that even genre fiction, modern authors today very often reference older material, very often reference classics, very often reference the great books. Some great examples of this are even in like John Dixon's Phoenix Island. This is a YA book, but its sequel, Devil's Pocket, specifically contains references and portions of it are allusions to Dante's Inferno, which of course is a several hundred-year-old or multiple hundred-year-old epic poem. Christopher Rocchio in The Sun Eater is very good at referencing a lot of older material in some subtle and even certain, like taking what we know and understand from the past and certain authors and references and twisting some of them on their head, sometimes using them a little bit straight up, but referencing a lot of older material in ways that are just like, if you've read that material, you can point to and be like, hey, he's read that thing too. I know what that reference is. You know, do the Leo Point GIF meme or the Captain America. I understood that. I understood that reference meme, you know, things like that. You get to be able to point out in certain modern fiction the references to older fiction if you've read those older fiction. And mind you, a lot of authors today have read a lot of literary fiction and can reference some of that kinds of stuff. Not all of them do, of course, but very many do. And some of those references you just will not understand, or they'll go right over your head. You'll never know they existed unless you've read that material. In some way, that can make reading even modern fiction a little bit more fun at times, is by knowing the references that are being made. I mean, really, how many times have people referenced Shakespeare, for example? Probably 1.5 million authors, or more than that, quite frankly. I would not be surprised, have referenced Shakespeare in some way, shape, or form. Do you have to have read Shakespeare to understand some of those references? Some of them, probably not, because they're kind of part of the cultural zeitgeist. But there's other aspects of just writing and English in general that we wouldn't have without Shakespeare, and kind of understanding where some of those things originate from is also just pretty cool. Plus, there's also the fact that I mentioned earlier, certain genre fiction can also be considered classics. Lord of the Rings is kind of the quintessential example. It's not just classic fantasy, it's not just the progenitor of the genre, and it is not just what popularized it. It is itself a classic. It's pretty old. I believe Lord of the Rings was published in the 50s, if I'm not mistaken, for the first time. That's quite a while ago. Another good example is even something like Dune, which is like the quintessential sci-fi book. This could, to some people, be considered a classic, even though it was published in, I believe, 1965. It's somewhat recently, and it is sci-fi. It is a genre fiction book, but it is not a classic just because of those things. So what I'm saying is that genre fiction does have its own merits, and we'll talk more about some of these things next week, and some of it references literary fiction and references certain classics and calls back to some of those things, has allusions, specifically because they were influenced by those things. And I think that's a very good thing. Think of it this way. Every book that we have today came from somewhere, and every book originated from somewhere. The exact form of the novel had to come from somewhere. Don Quixote was a large part of where the novel as a medium of writing came from. So without older books, without classics, we wouldn't have any of the books that we know and enjoy today. We wouldn't have any of the genre fiction that we have today. They just simply would not exist. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that discounting classics simply because they're old is kind of silly, because, you know, it's kind of like history. If you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat the bad things that come from it. If you don't know older fiction, if you don't know how the language came to be what it is, if you don't know how storytelling came to be the way that it is, you're probably not going to be able to utilize as much of those modes and those mediums and the details of language in general to explore as interesting of ideas. You might have the best story in the world, but if you've never read a book before, you're probably not going to be able to write that thing super compellingly. And in my experience, the more general, older, classic literary fiction you've read, the easier it becomes to be able to explore certain ideas because many of them just evoke certain great things in yourself. Finally, a general point that I want to make about classics is that old and dusty books aren't necessarily always boring. I know, I kind of discussed it at the beginning of this video. School has ruined reading for some people, and especially classics and older books, and made you, feel like you have to read them to analyze them. And I started off this heading by saying I love to be able to analyze books, but the truth is that you don't actually have to do that because some of them don't need to be. I'm not even arguing that all classics deserve to be considered classics. There are some classics that I've experienced that I'm like, I really don't understand why this specifically has stood the test of time, and many other people are going to feel that way about other books. Some of my favorites you might hate. Some of your favorites I might hate. That's just kind of the way that things go. But sometimes a simple mindset adjustment is all it takes to recognize that old books have their own kind of merit, even if they're a little bit different. Furthermore, as a little bit more of a general point, some books are also kind of really approachable for certain audiences of particular genres. For example, I don't know where Frankenstein disappeared down on my floor over here, but Frankenstein is not a bad pick for horror or sci-fi fans because it's kind of an early rendition of certain ideas that might be used a little bit more in those kinds of genres, the ideas of horror and gothic fiction in general, I guess, being the influence that it is on modern horror, for example. And although the sci-fi-ness of Frankenstein is a little bit on the looser end, there's still certain things about that might remind you of some of the sci-fi that you do enjoy. Count of Monte Cristo over here is the quintessential revenge plot. You might look at this and be like, oh wow, that's a thick book. Why would I ever want to read that? And though I understand being intimidated by a book's size to a certain degree, just understand that you also don't have to read these quickly. Nothing about reading is a race. But Count of Monte Cristo is a great example of a classic, albeit a little bit long, that reads very smoothly and very quickly. In particular, I recommend the Robin Buss translation into English of this because you'd never really guess that this book is as old as it is because of how superb the actual prose of the translation is. It feels modern enough that you feel like you're reading a modern book, even though you still know you're reading classic. And this is kind of the classic revenge story. So if you want to know where all other revenge plots come from, probably all of them have major influence from the Count of Monte Cristo, even if indirectly. This is like where a lot of that stuff comes from. Just like how a lot of modern fantasy calls back to Lord of the Rings. If you haven't read Lord of the Rings, you might not understand how and why a lot of that stuff comes from it, but it does, and reading it is kind of nice to understand a little bit more of that history. Les Miserables, aside from the tangents, I will acknowledge that the tangents exist, but the actual plot of Les Mis, wherever it exists, is a very human story and a very human exploration of tragedy. This is one that's a little bit, indirect, as opposed to Count of Monte Cristo, where there is the plot. The revenge plot is what the Count of Monte Cristo is doing. Les Mis is more about the exploration with those characters, with those people, and understanding the very human relationship with tragedy, like I said. So if you want something a little bit more like that, Les Mis has some of that in great strides. For epic fantasy readers, as a random example, War and Peace is a really, really great book for epic fantasy readers, not just because it's long, but because it has a lot of that sweeping epic tale. It journeys across a continent. It follows a couple different suites of characters. It has a lot of characters that you come to know and recognize and love, and there's several moving parts to it. I would say that War and Peace is not super complicated, but if you enjoy anything intricate the way that epic fantasy is often intricate, War and Peace is a very great way to start reading classics, just as a random example. So not only do I think that literary fiction has a lot for you to get out of it, I think that there are classics that are good and approachable, even for people who have only read modern genre fiction. If you don't know where to start, I'm sure there are plenty of places that you can turn to get kind of recommendations based off of the things that you do like in modern fiction. Just know and recognize that it is not inherently unapproachable to approach a book just because you haven't read very many old books before. Several of these more recent examples that I gave are actually also pretty easy reads, relatively speaking. War and Peace with the Anthony Briggs translation is surprisingly quick to read. Robin Buss translation of Count of Monte Cristo is super easy. The Christine Doniger translation of Les Mis was published in 2013. Like, it is very modern English without losing the tone and the vibe of what it is depicting. So again, even though books can be old, it doesn't necessarily make them unapproachable. Some certain older books in the English language, like Dickens or something like that, might be a little bit more archaic in the way that they use English or their language. But again, this is more of like a mindset thing, in my opinion. If you know that you're approaching a book that uses a little bit of an older form of English that maybe can be harder to parse nowadays, just go in understanding that. For example, me, when I read Tale of Two Cities earlier this year, I went in expecting for it to be actually a little bit more difficult than it ended up being, and I prepared myself for that. This isn't an old book, but Infinite Jest, I prepared for my sanity to just completely disappear trying to read that book. There are certain sections of it that are very complex to put together. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the reasons for that here in just a little bit. But I think it's because literary fiction and classics authors were more intentional about their language. And, you know, if it's an older time, 300-year-old English, or even Shakespeare, for example, like 500-year-old English, maybe not quite that long ago, more like 400-year-old English. Wait, yeah, that's probably more accurate. 400-year-old English is a very different beast. But there are also cases where maybe just a little bit of extra focus can crack the code, and sometimes reading along with like a guide can also be a little bit helpful. I don't think that anybody should be shamed for looking up what things meant if they didn't understand what a certain book was doing or certain sections of a book was doing. Shakespeare, for example, there are a lot of translations of Shakespeare that put some of that text more into a modern rendition of English so that we can understand what's going on and picture that a little bit better because, well, Shakespeare is pretty archaic English. Even Dickens is a little bit more archaic than today, and his sentence structure is difficult for even me to put together. Trust me, my only paid job at this point right now is copy editing. I understand a lot of what makes English work, and Dickens can be difficult for me to really get into just because the manner of the language is just different. Some classics require a little bit of extra focus, that is true, but you also have some other things, especially modern translations of certain books, that are super easy. And if you go into any of those books knowing what you're getting into and expecting to just put in that little extra ounce of effort, very often you'll find yourself surprisingly flying through it. Sometimes you'll come out of a book finding it a lot easier than you were expecting to. And as far as translations are concerned as well, don't be afraid to test out multiple translations. You can get samples of many different translations on different sites for several of the books that you might want to read, just to give one a shot. For example, Don Quixote is an example I've talked about, is one that has well over a dozen, it might even have upwards of 24 different translations at this point. So testing out what does and doesn't fit your vibe and what you appreciate reading, or what's easier to read for you yourself, or whatever the case may be, don't be afraid to kind of explore some of those things. I did something like that with Les Mis, and that's why I picked the Christine Doniger translation, and it worked very well for me. Same thing with the Robin Buss translation of Count of Monte Cristo. I just think it's important for people to be open to the idea that books don't have to be super simple to read, but they also don't have to be super intense to read. And more to circle back around to the plot that I think I lost about 15,000 years ago at this point. This recording is running super long. I think that literary fiction is worth reading because of the depth that it provides and because of how analyzable the material is. So if you are looking for something a little bit deeper to test a little bit more of yourself as a reader, literary fiction and classics can offer that for you. But even if you're not somebody looking for that, even if you are somebody who doesn't really want to analyze anything that they read, they just want to enjoy it for what it is, there are still classics for you. There are still classics that are easy to enjoy. This isn't an English class. Don't feel like you have to write a 5-page essay afterwards. I like to do that when I review books, but that's a personal thing that I came to discover that I just enjoy doing. And if you don't have to. And maybe reading some of these books without that requirement, without that expectation, might help you a little bit. Besides that, there's also the fact that many classics kind of make their more impactful, important points pretty subtly anyway. Not subtle as in they're kind of hidden in the book, but subtle as in they're not really things that you have to write about and analyze. They're things that are going to affect you a little bit more implicitly rather than smack you across the face. They're not things that are going to bitch slap you and tell you, hey, the curtains are blue because I, the author, am depressed. They're things that are just general implicit explorations of various topics and humanity and other stuff like that. The Count of Monte Cristo is the classic revenge story. It's not really trying to tell you a whole lot of things more deep than that if you don't care for anything deeper than that. If you just want a fun revenge plot, Count of Monte Cristo is a fun revenge plot, That's all that it has to be. But if you want a little bit more depth as well, if that's something you're looking for, many classics definitely offer that. Heck, there's also the point that I could make here is that you never know what books are just simply going to click for you or not. I anticipated that Les Mis would be a book that I enjoyed, but I didn't expect for it to basically become my favorite book of all time and essentially reside there since then. I expected for Count of Monte Cristo to be a fun revenge tale, but I wasn't expecting for the first 300 pages to be one of the most perfect sections of any book I've ever read, period. Just as you don't fully know what books in genre fiction today might really stand out to you and what might end up just being your favorite inherently, you don't necessarily know what of these books are going to do the same thing. Treating them as inherently different subsets of books isn't always the most helpful in this way. If you want to read Frankenstein just because it sounds interesting to you, by God, you should just read Frankenstein because it sounds interesting to you. Whether you get more of a deeper emotional meaning like I did from part 2 of that book doesn't really matter. If you read the book and you enjoy it, cool. If you don't understand why it's a classic, that's also fine. There's going to be a different classic that is going to click for you that way instead. It might be the case that lit bros might discount the impact or the quality that genre fiction can have. I think it's also pretty common for people who only read a lot of modern stuff to never touch anything older than they are, for example, discounted as just boring or try hard or old and dusty, or even kind of discounted as a form of that I'm better than that or whatever. There are snobs on both sides of this discussion, and I want to encourage people to not be that way and to just kind of explore a little bit more. To kind of wrap this video up a little bit, in my view, there is no reason to be inherently scared of classics or literary fiction. Don't get me wrong, some of these things are totally worthy of being scared of. James Joyce, for example, is not a particular classic author that I want to read. In fact, I explicitly do not want to read any James Joyce. Even Thomas Pynchon is an author that's a little bit tougher of a sell. Gravity's Rainbow, I'm still personally very scared of. Infinite Jest, I honestly get why some people might be scared of that. There's some pretty tough material in there, even if there's a lot of stuff that is surprisingly not that tough. But even in these cases, there is still something worth gleaning from almost any book you read. I guess that's kind of the thesis that I probably should have been making from the beginning of this video, so I'll probably leave it off with that. I rarely DNF books, and the reason for that is because even most books I dislike have something to learn from them. So you can try literary fiction to have a variety of explorative topics to potentially learn or glean something from, or even if you don't like the book, there's probably going to be some truth hidden in there that, makes an impact on you personally. You might be surprised by how much you love some of these books, and maybe even by how many of the books you end up loving, even if you've never really read very many of them. I think that if you want a great general resource for approaching classic literature, for approaching the great books, Benjamin McAvoy's YouTube channel is a great resource for that. Even if you don't join the Hardcore Literature Book Club, I'm not a member of it myself personally. Benjamin McAvoy's videos on how to read, at this point probably dozens of classics, are very insightful and just kind of make you excited to read some of these books. So if you want to try some of this stuff, explore, find what sounds interesting, look up, a good way to approach it. And Benjamin McAvoy's videos, especially many of his recent ones, are like hour and a half long on how to read a book. That is because they're very often providing context on the time of the author and when the book was written and other types of details of the society at the time, context that might make it easier to read some of those books. So if you want to try more literary fiction, I recommend his channel, and I'm sure there are others as well. But that's the particular creator that I watch on that respect. If you're somebody who hasn't read many classics or modern literary fiction either, just know that there is a new world of great novels to read out there that isn't necessarily the genre fiction. That doesn't mean you have to stop reading genre fiction entirely. I still read a lot of epic fantasy. I still read a little bit of sci-fi. I still read plenty of other stuff. In fact, I've actually not been reading as many classics the last couple of years as I've been wanting to, for example, because I've been reading more modern things instead. There's worthy things to read in both of these categories. And I think that's, like I said at the beginning, sloughing off either subset of fiction is generally just a pretty silly move. You do not have to jump into the deep end. Again, don't just go straight into Joyce or Pynchon or Infinite Jest, or don't even jump into Shakespeare or Dickens if you feel like that's going to be a little bit too much for you. Just find what sounds interesting to you and try that. Then keep exploring and getting feedback on where to go from there based off of what you do and don't resonate with or enjoy. I found many personal favorite books with classics. Les Miserables is the best example of this. And kind of as a result, the books that I review on this very channel has had a lot of variety because I've never, pigeonholed myself into a particular genre. I don't only cover epic fantasy. I don't only cover sci-fi. I don't only cover literary fiction even. I just read whatever sounds interesting to me, and I think that that is an important freedom that you should allow yourself. If you want to read a classic, don't feel like you shouldn't be allowed to. Don't let other people call you a fart sniffer just because you want to read a book that's 100 years old or something like that. That's pretty silly. Like I said, I found many personal favorite books in some of the great books, if you want to consider them that, and I have every confidence that you might as well if you approach them that way. And as I've hinted throughout, next week I'll talk about why genre fiction matters, and maybe at some point in the future I'll talk a little bit about modernism, postmodernism, and metamodernism in the literary fiction kind of idea of stuff, because originally I had, let me double check here real quick, a solid third of my video notes are about that topic specifically, and I chose not to include that in this video at all because my recording is already over an hour long, and I did not want to do that to you guys. Thank you for watching this video. If you did, I'm sure this is a mess. I'll try to edit it together the best that I can, but I'm not entirely confident in my abilities at the time of my recording this. I have just a few hours to get this edited before I need to get it rendered so that I can upload it for tomorrow. So I don't have very much time to go on this. This is running against the clock for sure, and I apologize if this was messy. I wanted this to be a little bit better than several of my similar type of discussion videos on this channel have been, where they've kind of just been half-assed and just go through a couple random points and topics and just go back and forth between things that don't actually make that much sense. And at this point, I feel like I just did that even worse and made it 3 times as long. So I really apologize if this video was bad, but I appreciate you watching it if you did. If you are somebody who hasn't read very many classics, I urge you to try some, and I hope you do. But otherwise, I will be back next week with a Why Genre Fiction Matters video, and I hope that that video ends up better than this one, because I'm pretty sure this one was garbage. Anyway, for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.